I never thought my life could change so drastically with one phone call. But that's exactly what happened that evening as I sat in my 20th floor apartment in the center of New York City. "Emily, I'm not coming back. I've met someone else. We're flying to Las Vegas today." Jason's voice, my husband's voice, sounded cold and detached. Years of marriage ended in a 30-second phone call. I slowly lowered the phone and looked out the window at the twinkling lights of evening Manhattan. My first impulse was to burst into tears, to scream, to start begging him to come back. But I held back. Instead, I calmly made myself a cup of tea and sat down in my favorite chair by the window. A slight smile appeared on my face. "You have no idea what a mistake you've made, darling," I whispered, taking a sip of the hot drink. Jason thought he had left a sweet and naive housewife who took care of the home while he built his business. But that was just a mask. Before marriage, I worked in the security department of a major investment bank on Wall Street. I was well versed in finance, knew everything about how people try to hide their assets, and was able to find even the most cleverly hidden funds. I also had a phenomenal memory and connections that my husband never even suspected. The next morning, I took out a thick folder of documents from the safe hidden behind a painting in the bedroom. For 15 years, I had methodically collected information about Jason's business, copying important documents, recording names and dates. He thought I was trusting and simple-minded, so he often discussed his affairs right at home on the phone. He had no idea that every conversation was recorded on a hidden dictaphone, and every document carelessly left on the table was photographed. "Let's see how you like an unscheduled tax audit," I muttered, dialing the number of my old friend Sarah, who now held a high position in the tax service. "Sarah, good morning. Remember you said I could turn to you for help? I think the time has come." An hour later, we met in a small cafe away from the city center. Sarah carefully studied the documents, and her eyes widened more and more. "My God, Emily, this is double bookkeeping, shell companies, tax evasion on a particularly large scale. And this is just the beginning. Why did you keep quiet for so many years?" "Because I loved him, or thought I loved him," I shrugged. "But now he's destroyed everything himself." Sarah thoughtfully tapped her fingers on the table. "You know, we're just planning a large-scale audit of companies in this sector. I think your husband's firms will be first on the list." The first blow hit Jason a week after arriving in Las Vegas. He was just enjoying breakfast on the terrace of a 5-star hotel overlooking the famous Strip when his phone exploded with messages. "Boss, we have problems. Jason, contact me urgently. Emergency. They know everything. Absolutely everything." Next to him sat Mandy, a young, long-legged blonde for whom he had left me. She watched curiously as the expression on his face changed. "Did something happen, honey?" "No, just work stuff," Jason lied, feeling cold sweat running down his back. He went to the room and started calling the directors of his companies. The picture was bleak. The tax authorities had descended on all his offices simultaneously, and judging by the questions the inspectors were asking, they knew exactly where to look. But how? I had everything covered, Jason thought in despair. Later that day, the chief accountant called him. "They found all the shell companies, every single one, even those that only you and I knew about." Jason collapsed into a chair, feeling the ground slipping from under his feet. Had someone leaked information? But who? And most importantly, why now? Mandy wasn't a stupid girl. In her 26 years, she had learned to unerringly determine the moment when it was time to abandon a sinking ship. And now all the signs indicated that the ship called Jason was slowly but surely sinking into a sea of problems. She had been watching him for a week. Jason had practically stopped sleeping, constantly talking on the phone, yelling. His well-groomed hands began to tremble. He started economizing. First, he canceled the booked yacht cruise, then asked her to choose a simpler restaurant, and yesterday he even suggested moving from the luxurious hotel room to ordinary apartments. "Honey, what's going on?" Mandy asked when Jason once again nervously threw the phone away after a conversation. "Nothing special. Small business problems. Everything will be resolved in a couple of weeks," he snapped. Mandy smiled softly and stroked his shoulder, but in her head she was already working out an escape plan. She knew enough about business to understand that such problems don't resolve quickly. "Maybe you need to go back?" she cautiously suggested. "Sort things out on the spot?" "No," Jason replied too sharply. While he was trying to save the remnants of his empire over the phone, Mandy opened her laptop and booked a business class ticket to Los Angeles. One of the most useful things she had learned in life was to always have a backup plan. The next morning, as usual, she kissed Jason, said she was going shopping, and left the room with a small bag containing the most expensive gifts he had managed to give her. She never returned to that room. A couple of hours later, sitting on the plane with a glass of champagne, she sent Jason a message. "Sorry, darling, but I'm not made for poverty. Good luck with your problems. P.S. Don't try to find me. It's useless." Jason looked at Mandy's message for the 10th time, but the meaning still wouldn't sink in. How could she, after everything he had done for her? He tried to call her, but the phone was turned off. He checked their shared social media accounts. She had deleted him from her friends. He called the boutiques where she liked to shop. No one had seen her. "Rats are the first to flee a sinking ship," he whispered, throwing the phone against the wall. At that moment, a new message came from the financial director. "The company's accounts have been frozen. All accounts, even the reserve ones in Hong Kong." Jason felt nausea rising in his throat. He poured himself a whiskey, drank it in one gulp, and suddenly froze. Something was bothering him. Something about this situation was wrong. The tax audit, Mandy's departure, the freezing of accounts. Everything happened too quickly and smoothly, as if someone had specifically planned this catastrophe. But who? And then it hit him like a bolt of lightning. Emily, his quiet, obedient wife. But no, that's impossible. She didn't understand anything about business. Or did she? He remembered how she sometimes asked strangely precise questions about his affairs, how attentively she listened to his phone conversations, how often she fussed with some papers. "Damn, I think I severely underestimated my wife," Jason muttered. Meanwhile, I was sitting in my old office in the Financial Alliance Bank building, looking at a photograph on the table. 10 young specialists in security service uniforms, class of 2005. I remembered each one by name, knew their fates, kept in touch. And now these connections proved invaluable. "I didn't expect your call after so many years," said Michael Stevens, the bank's security director, pouring tea. "But I always knew you were my best student." I smiled, remembering my first days at the bank. It was Michael who taught me the art of financial intelligence, showed me how to detect fraud and track illegal transactions. "Remember the Carson case in 2004? I asked. "When we uncovered the scheme with offshore companies?" "Of course," he nodded. "That was your first major operation. You unraveled a web of 30 shell companies in a week. Jason uses exactly the same scheme. I took out a folder of documents. Only the scale is bigger, and I know all the details. Michael looked through the papers and whistled. You know, his companies are serviced by our bank. I think we should conduct an unscheduled audit of their accounts. In the framework of combating money laundering, of course. Jason paced around the hotel room like a caged animal. Over the past few days, he had made 3 critical mistakes that only worsened his position. First, he tried to urgently transfer the remaining money through a network of shell companies to Singapore, but the system unexpectedly worked against him. The transactions were blocked, and the financial monitoring services of several banks began their own investigations. Then he decided to use his connections in the tax inspectorate. He called his friend, transferred a large sum, and an hour later learned that the friend had been arrested for attempting to bribe an official. It turned out that the friend's phone had been tapped for several months. Finally, Jason tried to cover his tracks. He gave instructions to destroy documentation in the office, but he didn't consider that his former system administrator, fired 2 months ago for incompetence, was my old friend from the bank. All the files they tried to delete had long been stored in a safe place. Boss, the financial director's voice on the phone trembled. We have new problems. The bank has frozen all accounts. Which bank? Jason asked tiredly. Financial Alliance. Jason went cold. He remembered how I had said many years ago that I worked at some bank. Could it be? In a small cafe in the center of New York, 5 people gathered. They all once worked in the security service of Financial Alliance, and all owed me. Victor, now head of the cybercrime department, had managed to withdraw his savings from the bank a day before its collapse in 2008, thanks to my warning. Helen, who became the head of compliance at a large company, got this position on my recommendation. David, working in an international consulting firm, still remembered how I covered up his mistake at the beginning of his career, which could have cost him his job. So, I said, thank you for coming. I need your help. I laid out the documents on the table, and for the next 2 hours we methodically dissected Jason's schemes, finding more and more vulnerabilities in his empire. You know, Helen said as we were finishing, your husband made the classic mistake of many smart fraudsters. He got so carried away with complex schemes that he didn't notice the obvious. The enemy can be right next to you. 3 months later, Jason sat in a cheap hostel in Las Vegas, looking at his phone screen. He could no longer pay the bill for the 5-star hotel room. All his credit cards were blocked, accounts frozen, and his business was crumbling like a house of cards. He dialed my number for the 10th time in the last week, and for the first time in all this time, I answered. Hello? My voice sounded calm and cold. Emily, he faltered, not knowing where to start. Emily, we need to talk. About what, Jason? About how you stole my money? Or about how you left with your mistress, not even finding the courage to tell me this to my face? I was an idiot. His voice trembled. I ruined everything. I know, but let's talk. I can explain everything. Explain? There were notes of irony in my voice. What exactly do you want to explain? How for years you used shell companies to evade taxes, or how you funneled money through offshore accounts. Jason went cold. How do you? I always knew, Jason. Every single one of your schemes. What a fool I was. Emily, listen. He was almost begging. Mandy left me as soon as the problem started. You were right about everything. I want to come back. There was silence on the other end of the line. "Come back?" I finally said. "Where do you want to come back to, Jason? To our apartment, which I've already sold? To the business you destroyed with your greed? Or to that version of me who, as you thought, doesn't understand anything about finance?" "I'll fix everything," he was almost pleading. "I still have connections, options." "No, Jason." My voice became harsh. "You have nothing. No connections, no options. You know what's most interesting? I didn't do anything illegal. I just showed law enforcement what you had been so carefully hiding for years." "Is this revenge?" he asked dully. "No," I smirked. "This is justice. And you know what? It's time for you to go. I heard the FBI really wants to talk to you." After the conversation with Jason, I stood for a long time at the window of my new office. Only 3 months had passed, and my life had changed completely. I opened my own consulting firm specializing in financial security. My old connections and reputation in banking circles provided a solid client portfolio. The phone rang again. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. "Emily Johnson." The voice on the phone was official. "Agent Parker. We have information that Jason Johnson bought a ticket to New York next week." "Thank you for the information, Agent Parker," I replied. "Keep me posted." Hanging up, I smiled. Jason is flying to New York. Well, I'll make sure he gets a proper welcome. Jason got off the plane with one small suitcase. There was no trace left of his former glossy appearance. A crumpled suit, stubble, the dull look of a man who had lost everything. No one was meeting him in the arrival hall. He took out his phone, intending to call a taxi, when he noticed a group of people purposefully moving in his direction. "Jason Johnson?" asked a tall man in plain clothes, showing his ID. "I'm Agent Parker, FBI. You're being detained on suspicion of tax evasion on a particularly large scale and asset withdrawal through shell companies." Jason didn't resist when handcuffs clicked on his wrists. "Your wife is a very competent specialist," Agent Parker remarked. "It's a pity you didn't appreciate it earlier." In the detention center, Jason was handed a thick folder of documents. Reading them, he physically felt his business empire crumbling. His main partner in Europe, learning about problems with the tax authorities, terminated all contracts. A large government order he was counting on went to a competitor. Banks, one after another, closed credit lines. His company's stocks plummeted 90% after news of the investigation. Minority shareholders filed a class action lawsuit. Clients were massively terminating contracts. "How quickly can something built over years be destroyed?" he muttered, looking through financial reports. His once successful holding had turned into a pile of debts and obligations. Even if he miraculously avoided criminal liability, it was already impossible to restore the business. I sat in my office, browsing the news. Headlines flashed on the screen. Holding declares bankruptcy. Johnson Company stocks depreciate to historic low. Largest clients terminate contracts with disgraced businessman's companies. I was interrupted by a call from Agent Parker. "Mrs. Johnson, your ex-husband has started giving testimony. It looks like he's decided to make a deal with the investigation." "Thank you, Agent Parker. Keep me informed." I approached the window. Life was bustling below. People hurrying about their business, not suspecting that in one of the offices above, a woman had just put an end to a 15-year-long story. On my desk lay a fresh issue of Financial Herald, with my photo on the cover and the headline, "New Name in Financial Consulting, How to Build a Business on Honesty." A year later, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, business representatives, former partners. Everyone was waiting for the verdict in the case that the press dubbed the crash of the decade. Jason Johnson, haggard and aged after months of investigation, stood in the defendant's cage. His once expensive suit hung like a sack on his thinned figure. The judge monotonously read out the verdict. Found guilty of tax evasion on a particularly large scale, organizing a criminal scheme for asset withdrawal. Sentenced to 8 years imprisonment to be served in a federal prison. But I had more important things to do. While my ex-husband was listening to his sentence, I was giving a presentation of a new financial security system for a major international bank. My consulting firm had become one of the market leaders in a year. After the presentation, the chairman of the bank's board of directors approached me. "Mrs. Johnson, amazing work. You know, I've been following the story with your ex-husband. It's amazing how one person could so virtuously and, most importantly, legally expose such a large-scale scheme." I smiled. Sometimes the strongest weapon is knowledge and patience. And, of course, faith in justice. In the evening, I sat on the terrace of my new country house. Next to me stood a cup of my favorite tea, and on my lap lay a fresh issue of Forbes with my photo on the cover. Woman of the Year in Finance, the success story of Emily Johnson. I took out my phone and opened the last message from Jason, sent before the verdict was announced. "Now I understand what a mistake I made. You were much smarter and stronger than I thought. Forgive me, although I know I don't deserve forgiveness." I didn't reply to this message. Instead, I opened the calendar and checked the time of tomorrow's meeting. I had a dinner date with Alexander, the owner of an investment company whom I met at a recent conference. A man who saw me not just as a beautiful woman, but as an equal partner and professional. Looking at the sunset, I thought about how strange life is. Sometimes you need to lose everything to find yourself. Jason, without realizing it, did me a huge favor. He made me remember who I really am. The next few years flew by like a moment. My company grew rapidly, opening offices in the world's largest financial centers. I spoke at international conferences, gave interviews to leading business publications, consulted governments on financial security issues. Alexander became not only my life partner, but also a reliable support in business. Together, we developed a revolutionary system for protection against financial fraud, which we implemented in the world's largest banks. One day, while going through the morning mail, I came across a letter from prison. Jason wrote that he had been thinking a lot about his life, about how everything went wrong. He apologized, said he finally understood the value of honesty and decency. He asked for a meeting. I looked at this letter for a long time, remembering our life together. Then I slowly tore it up and threw it in the trash. The past remained in the past, and I wasn't going to return to it. That same evening, I was speaking to graduates of Harvard's economics department. Looking into the eyes of these young, ambitious people, I said, "Success is not just money and power. Real success is the ability to look in the mirror every morning and respect the person you see there. Never betray yourself, your principles and values, because in the end, this is what defines who you are." After the speech, a young girl approached me. In her eyes burned the same fire that once burned in mine. "Mrs. Johnson, your story is inspiring. I want to be like you. Where should I start?" I smiled, remembering myself at her age. Start with honesty. First of all, with honesty to yourself. And never let anyone make you feel less significant than you really are. Returning home, I thought about how my life had changed over these years. From a modest housewife whom no one took seriously to one of the most influential women in the world of finance, I proved that you can achieve success while remaining honest and true to your principles. At home, Alexander was waiting for me with a glass of champagne. To you, my queen of finance. I laughed and clinked glasses with him. To us, to making this world a little better and more honest. Falling asleep that night, I thought about Jason. I hope he really understood his mistakes and will change. But that's no longer my story. My story continues, and it's just beginning. In the morning, a new day awaited me, new challenges and new opportunities. And I was ready to meet them with my head held high, knowing that whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. No matter what happens, I'll stand. Because I'm Emily Johnson, and I know my true worth. Did you like the story? Write your opinion in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next interesting story. See you tomorrow.